How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chavav, Daf 26 of Masechet Menachos. Friends, Daf 26 is great. It's the kind of daf that I think should kind of keep relatively moving, which is nice. There are 4 sections, which make me a little bit concerned in terms of, well, not concerned, that's really not the right word. It's like, it's just whenever recently I feel like, oh wow, this daf kind of moved. Maybe it'll be quicker. But when, we pointed out in the past, whenever there's a lot of sections, that's usually not the case. Anyways, section number 1, when there's a problem with the shirayim, whether the shirayim got tameh, or whether the shirayim got lost or burnt, what happens? This is actually a machlokas that we've seen before, so we will have a look at that. What to do with the kometz? Also a machlokas that we've seen before, meaning once the kohen scoops out the kometz from the mixing bowl, then what happens? Next, burning the kometz in multiple goes. Okay, so once you have the kometz, do you have to burn it all at once? Can you burn it in, can you divide it in half? We will discuss that. That's kind of a small machlokas. And then, at which point the kometz is considered burned? A very interesting question, right? Zrikas Adam, when it comes to a korban, so you take the blood, you throw it on the mizbeach, that's done. You can now eat the meat, or burn the emurim, whatever. When it comes to a korban mincha, so after the kometz is burned, so then the shirayim is mutter for the kohanim to eat. What's considered burned though? Because the burning is something that actually takes time. Is throwing it in the fire, is it considered burnt? You're done, now the kohanim can eat it. You have to wait for a certain amount of consumption to happen. So that is the final discussion of today's daf. Chevra, I enjoyed learning this daf. I'm sure it's going to be a great one. Let's jump in. Friends, we begin on daf Chavav, Amud Aleph, 4 lines into the daf at the Mishnah. Nitmu shirayim, nisrafu shirayim, avdu shirayim. What happens if the shirayim either become tameh, or get burnt up, or get lost? What does this mean? Well, you had the korban mincha, right? You had, let's say, a minchas nesachim, sure. You had the mixing bowl, the flour, the oil, great. The kohen takes a kometz and puts the kometz in the kometz bowl, great. Now, somehow the mixing bowl, big mess. All the shirayim, everything that was left in the mixing bowl became tameh, or got all burnt up, or misplaced, or whatever it is. Now you're left with the kometz, but no shirayim. So then what happens? So it says the Mishnah, Kemidas Rabbi Eliezer Kshera, Kemidas Rabbi Yeshua Psula. So this is a machlokas that we've actually seen at least twice before. A machlokas between, so it says Kemidas Rabbi Eliezer, like the principle of Rabbi Eliezer Kshera. Kemidas Rabbi Yeshua, like the principle of Rabbi Yeshua Psula. What's the principle of Rabbi Eliezer? What's the principle of Rabbi Yeshua? This is a machlokas that we've seen in terms of what happens if the meat gets lost or something. The meat of a korban, do you still do zrikas adam? Rabbi Yeshua's opinion is in ein basar, ein dam, as we've seen before. If there's no meat, then there's no zrikas adam. The opinion of Rabbi Eliezer is afal pi she'ein basar yesh dam, that even though there's no meat, you can still do zrikas adam. So to sort of transfer that to our discussion of Menachos, so you have the kometz, but the shirayim is gone. So Rabbi Eliezer, who says im af al pi she'ein basar yesh dam, so kemidas Rabbi Eliezer, like Rabbi Eliezer's principle, he would apply that principle here and say af al pi she'ein shirayim yesh kometz. Even though there's no shirayim, you would still burn the kometz, as he says over here. Kemidas Rabbi Eliezer ksher, the kometz is still kosher, the mincha is still kosher. Take the kometz, burn it. Whereas Kemidas Rabbi Yeshua, like Rabbi Yeshua, the principle of Rabbi Yeshua, who says by the korban, or really by the animal, im ein basar ein dam, if there's no meat, there's no zrikas adam. Here also, im ein shirayim ein kometz, since the shirayim is gone, you don't burn the kometz, and he says psula, the mincha is pisula. Okay, givaldik. So like this, so basically the machlokes that we see between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua when it comes to an animal is just kind of applied for Menachos. Says the Gemara, Amar Rab, says Rab, who shenitmu kol shariel, miksa shariel lo. Okay, Rav says that when Rabbi Yoshua says that when the shirayim become tamei, so it's notable that Rav specifically says nitmu, right? So Amar Rav Usha nitmu kol shirayim, that so specifically talking about tuma, when Rabbi Yoshua says that the shirayim became tamei and therefore there's no burning of the kometz, that's when all of the shirayim became tamei, and there's no shirayim that's tahor, it's all tamei. In that case, Rabbi Yoshua says don't burn the kometz. But if only some of the shirayim became tamei, well, as long as there is shirayim that's tahor, you can burn the kometz. Okay, Givaldi. Let's read that again. Amar Rav, says Rav, V'u shenitmu kol shirayim, that when Rabbi Yoshua says we don't burn the kometz, that is when all of the shirayim became impure, tamei. Aval mixas shirayim, but if only some of the shirayim became impure, but other parts of the shirayim are tahor, lo, well then Rabbi Yoshua's opinion does not apply, i.e. you would burn the kometz. So it enters your mind, as I noted, that Rab specifically mentioned tuma over here, that when part of the shirayim are tahor, you can burn the kometz, implying nitma'in. Sure, this applies. This principle is by tuma avud v'sarif lo. However, if the shirayim got lost or burnt, maybe Rav is explaining that Rabbi Yoshua would say by avud and saruf, by lost and burnt, even though some of it was not lost and is still here, some of it was not burnt and is still here, you would not burn the kometz. I'm trying to figure out how to, right, even when I was learning it earlier, I was thinking like, how am I going to explain this in a positive way rather than a double negative kind of way? But basically, the it's not a difficult principle. It's just, it's very easy to fall into the double negatives, which is obviously confusing. So the simple way to explain this, and it really is simple, is that, so since Rav only mentioned Tumah, so we thought to say that this principle of, hey, if some of it is still Tahor, you can burn the kometz, maybe that's only by Tumah. And maybe when we're talking about the shirayim getting lost, the concept of, hey, well, some of it's still here, let's burn the kometz. Or when some of it gets burnt and we say, well, hey, there's still some of it here, let's burn the kometz. No, you can't burn the kometz. The concept of going ahead with burning the kometz when some of it remains is reserved for tumah. If some of it becomes tamei, but some of it is tahor, you can burn the kometz. But once some of it gets burned or once some of it gets lost, you can't burn the kometz. Okay. My kosaver. Now, if that were the case, that there is such a distinction, that when some of the shirayim is tahor, you can burn the kometz, and yet when we're talking about the shirayim getting burnt or lost, even though some of it remains, you can't burn the kometz. Well, then how do we explain, what would be the logic, what would be the principle at play over here to be able to understand such a distinction? What Micah Savar, what does Rabbi Yeshua hold? Or at least Rav in explaining Rabbi Yeshua. If we say that there is significance to the fact that some of the shirayim remains, which is why when some of the shirayim is tahor, you can go ahead with burning the kometz, well then afilu avud v'saruf nami. Well, if it is of significance that some of the shirayim remains, well then great. So long as some of the shirayim remains, I don't care what happened to the part that's gone. I don't care if it's tamei, I don't care if it's arvud, I don't care if it's saruf. I don't care what happened to it. The important thing is that some of the shirayim remains. Go ahead with burning the kometz. There should be no distinction between tumah versus avud and saruf. Go ahead and burn the kometz so long as some of the shirayim remains. And if we say that I don't care that any of it remains, okay, which explains why by avud and saruf, even though some of it remains, you can't burn the kometz. that once some of it gets burnt or some of it gets lost, you can no longer burn the kometz. V'nitma my time it sits. And as we learned yesterday, just in time for today's Gemara, that, well, if the shirayim become tameh, so then in principle, even if only some of it became tameh, you can't burn the kometz. But the reason why you can is because saved by the tzitz, that the tzitz is miratze. Well then, ihachi kol shirei anami. Well then, why are we saying that only when some of it became tameh can you go ahead with burning the kometz? If we're talking about the tzitz miratze, even if all of the shirayim became tameh, the tzitz is miratze. So we're trying to understand how we can understand such a distinction between tumah versus avud and sarif. So rather, the Gemara says, le'olam kasar v'shirah milsei v'nitma v'hu adin the avud v'sarif. So answers the Gemara, the diuk was incorrect. Answers the Gemara that when Rav says that so long as some of the shirayim remains tahor, you can go ahead with burning the kometz, the same would apply to avud and saruf. So long as some of the shirayim remain, go ahead with burning the kometz. When Rabbi Yeshua says you can't burn the kometz, that's when there's no shirayim left at all. Whether because it's all tameh, whether because it's all lost, or whether it's because it's all burnt. When there's no shirayim at all, Rabbi Yeshua says you can't burn the kometz in that case. So long as there is some shirayim, as we're going to discuss more in a minute, as long as there's some shirayim, i.e. more than a kezayis, well then you can go ahead with burning the kometz, regardless of if we're talking about a scenario of nitma, nisraf, ne'evad, no difference. V'hai de ka'amr nitma reshayu nokat. The reason why Rab mentioned nitma specifically is because if you look at our Mishnah, it's the first on the list. That's simply why. Right? Our Mishnah says nitmu sharia, nisifu sharia, avdu sharia. The first on the list was nitma. So therefore, Rav referenced basically the trio, the three of them, by referencing the first one that was mentioned, but the same halacha applies to all three, that so long as some of the shirayim remain, go ahead with burning the kometz. I'm going to drink a shtick of water and then we'll go weiter. Okay. Kidisanya, as we learn in a brisa, friends, this is a brisa that I thought we were learning for the third time. Apparently we're learning it for maybe even the fourth or fifth time. We saw it on Zvachim Daf Chafei, Zvachim Daf Kuf Tes, Psachim Daf Ayin Tes, and earlier on Daf Tes. So apparently this is the fifth time that we are learning this brisa. Kidisanya, as we learn in a brisa, Rabbi Yeshua says, Rabbi Yeshua, Kol Azvachim Shabateire, all korbanis, all animals in the Torah, Shnishtayimin, Kazayis Busar, Kazayis Chelev, that whenever it comes to a animal sacrifice, so long as one kazayis of meat or one kazayis of chelev remains from the animal, Zarek es Adam, you can move ahead with Zrik es Adam. And this is the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, right? So Rabbi Yoshua, who says that in ein basar, ein dam, that when there's no meat, you go ahead with Zrik es Adam, that means that there's no meat at all. But as long as there is a kazayis of meat that remains, or even a kazayis of chelev that remains, you may go ahead with zrikas adam. Kachatzi zayis busa v'kachatzi zayis chelev. However, if we're talking about a half a zayis of meat plus a half a zayis of chelev, they are incompatible. They cannot join together to say, hey, there's a kazayis of the animal. That does not work. Einu zarek es adam. You would not do zrikas adam in that case because achila and haktorah are not mitzarif to make a kazayis. Uva ola, however, when it comes to a korban ola, afilu kachatzi zayis basu v'kachatzi zayis chelev zorek es adam. However, when it comes to a korban ola, okay, if we're talking about a korban ola, and what remains from the korban ola is just a half zayis of meat and a half zayis of chelev, can you go ahead and do zrikas adam? The answer by an ola is yes. The answer is yes, because every part of an ola is burnt. The meat is burnt, the chelev is burnt, and therefore, since it's all being burnt on the mizbeach, there is a kazayis left of what is going to be burnt in the Mizbeach, and that can join together, and you can do Zrikas Adam in that case. Because all of the Ola is anyways burnt in the Mizbeach. Uva mincha, when it comes to korban mincha, afilu kula kayemis, even if all of the korban mincha is kayemis, lo yizrok, you don't do zrikas adam. Mincha ma'avidta. Why are we talking about zrikas adam by a korban mincha? Rav Papa says, Rav Papa minchas nisachim, that we are talking about minchas nisachim, i.e., if you have a korban, I think a korban ola, for example, you would have minchas nisachim. So let's say all of the, when I think we're going to get, I have to imagine that ahead of us we are going to become experts in minchas nisachims and nisuch hayayin, such that every time I say nisuch hayayin, I won't have to double check to say, wait, don't say yain nesach. Anyways, in the meantime, I'll say I'm fairly confident that a korban ola has nisachim, are offered with a minchas nisachim. So now, if the korban ola is entirely gone, nothing is left, no meat, no chelev, and the question is, can you do zrikas adam? Because after all, the minchas nesachim remains in 100% intact. Even can you do zrikas adam? The answer is no. Right, as we just said, uva mincha afilu kula kayamis. Even if the entire minchas nesachim is intact, but there is nothing that remains, there's no kazayas left from the animal. So then lo yizrok, we said don't do zrikas adam. So again, Amar Papa minchas nesachim sakadaitich. I may have thought hoil uvahade zevach ka'asya, since the minchas nesachim is brought together with the korban, kigufe deziv chadamya, maybe it should be considered like the korban itself, and so long as the mincha is intact, you should be able to do zrikas adam. Kamash malan, you can't. We need that what remains is part of the animal. Givaldik. So we see that Rabbi Yoshua, who says im ein basar ein dam, that literally means ein basar at all. But so long as there's a kazais, you can do zrikas adam. And like we said, by mincha, the same principle would apply, that so long as there is some shirayim, you can go ahead with the burning of the kometz. Menan Emili, how do we know that according to Rabbi Yoshua, so long as there is a kazais, even of chelev? I think that's the point. Where's the Rashi on this? Come on, Rashi. Yeah, exactly. That Minan really, how do you know that according to Rabbi Yeshua, so long as even if there's a kazayis of chelev, there's no meat left, but there's a kazayis of chelev left, that you can go ahead with the zrikas adam. Omar Reb Yechanan says, Reb Yechanan Mishum Reb Yishmael Givaldig Umatba Mishum Reb Yeshua ben Chananya. And somehow Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya fits in to this. I guess maybe the point is that Rabbi Yochanan is saying from Rabbi Yishmael, who's maybe explaining Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, maybe is the point. That's like a lot of generations right there. I was thinking about it earlier. I was also thinking about earlier how it's like a little bit hard for me to place Rabbi Yochanan in terms of like chronology. Obviously, he's a first generation Amora, but for some reason, he's a first generation Amora in Eretz Yisrael. Now, for some reason though, I don't know why, it feels like Rabbi Yochanan somehow, there's something about Rabbi Yochanan that's a little bit hard to place. I don't know why. I guess maybe it makes sense. I mean, this is the Talmud Babble, right? I feel like it's easier for me to I feel like the Tanaim in Eretz Yisrael, I can kind of have some kind of map in my head of like who's like what the connections are. And I feel like the Amoraim in Babble, I kind of have a map also of like, some of the big names, how they're connected. The Amoraim in Eretz Yisrael seem to be like a little bit looser in some ways. Like you have Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Bo, like Rabbi Amin, Rabbi Asi, Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Yirmiyah, but they all kind of like, a bunch of those names kind of, I guess a lot of the Amoraim in general were like going back and forth between Eretz Yisrael and Babel, not Rabbi Yochanan. But like Rav spent some time in both. Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi did. Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Yirmiyah. I think Rabbi Yirmiyah. Anyways, yeah, it's like a little bit hard to place. Rabbi Yochanan, as far as I know, was only in Eretz Yisrael, and also Rish Lakish. Now, Rabbi Yochanan's Rebbe, I believe, was Chizkiah, Chizkiah was a son of Reb Chia. Reb Chia was a contemporary of Rebbe. So like you can kind of like make the connections. They're just not like as obvious. I don't know. Then again, who is Shmuel's Rebbe? Who was Shmuel's Rebbe? Maybe like Karna or something? That's an interesting question. You know who Shmuel's like students were? Rav Yehuda, Rav Nachman. Interesting. Okay, Al Kopanim. So there's an interesting generational thing over here, right? So you have Rabbi Yochanan jumping up to Rabbi Yishmael. That's a big gap. Because I guess you could say like Rabbi Yochanan, who was a student of Chizkiah, who was a son of Rabbi Chia, who was kind of a contemporary of Rebbe. Rebbe was like a student of all of the Talmidei Rabbi Akiva. We've learned together that Rebbe was basically a student of all of Rabbi Akiva's students. He was a student of, we learned somewhere, I was trying to look it up earlier, that Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai was, I think, the posek in the base Rebbe. I was trying to find that, but I did find the sources thank God I was able to remember where we see that Rebbe was a student of Reb Meir, Rebbe was a student of Reb Shimon, Rebbe was a student of Reb Elazar. And we just said that Rabbi Yehuda was the posek in the household of Rebbe. Rebbe is, I'm not sure what the direct relationship with Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi is, but clearly there was a connection between Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi, and they were all the students of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was a contemporary of Rabbi Yishmael. So basically, we're saying Rabbi Yochanan is saying from Rabbi Yishmael. That's kind of a big jump, right? Again, we have Rabbi Yochanan, his Rebbe was Chizkiah, who was a student of Reb Chia, who was a contemporary of Rebbe, who was a Talmud of the Talmidei Reb Akiva, who were students obviously of Reb Akiva, who was a contemporary of Reb Yishmael, who was then saying it in the name of Rabbi Yoshua, which is even one generation earlier. So, big kind of range there. Okay, so back to our question. How do we know that even if a kazayis of chaylev remains, that you can go ahead with the zrikas adom? So again, Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shmuel, Umatuba Mishum Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. Omar Kra, the pasuk says, V'iktir achelev l'reach nichoach la Hashem. The pasuk says, so this taka a pasuk, friends. We didn't really learn all, that's interesting. We didn't really learn all about this pasuk, but we learned all about the surrounding pasuks. This is a pasuk in the context of shchutei chutz, which we learned plenty about. Very complicated sugya at the end of Masechta Zvachim. Shchutei chutz ha'aloha b'chutz. It is Perek Yud Zayin of Sefer Vayikra, the first 10 or so psukim. Pasuk Vav, I think, pasuk Vav of those 10 or so psukim is this one. That it says, I'll read you the pasuk V'zarak hakohenes adam. That because what you have to do, don't do shchutei chutz. Rather, what you need to do is bring it to the Beis Hamikdash. V'zarak hakohenes adam al mizbach Hashem Pesach Oil Moed v'hiktir achelev. So we have zrikas adam and v'hiktir achelev. Right again, V'zarak hakohenes adam, and it says v'hiktir achelev. So in the pasuk says v'hiktir achelev v'ech nichoach la'Hashem chelev afal pi shein basar. Even though none of the meat is there, but so long as there's chelev, you can do the zrikas adam. Ashkachan chelev yoseres v'shtei klayos minalan. Okay, fine. So long as there's chelev that remains, you could do zrikas adam. What if no chelev remains? No meat remains, no chelev remains. But there is the yoseres hakaved and the shtei klayos. When are we going to learn about that? I've been wondering this for a while. Yoseres hakaved, I think it's defined as the diaphragm. Don't really know what that is. And the shtei klayos, or the two kidneys, kind of know what that is. That is the emurim be'etzem. But like, when are we going to learn about what exactly these emurim are and for what korban is? I mean, we could probably just literally read it in the psukim. And I imagine that when Sefer Vayikra comes up in maybe a month or two, I think our relationship with the parshas of Sefer Vayikra, I imagine, going to be very different. All of a sudden, it becomes a whole chazara of the last 6 months or so. So anyways, I don't know where we're going to talk about Yoseres HaKav and Shtei Klayos. I don't know, maybe more. We still have a few months of Menachos left. Maybe we'll talk about it here in Menachos, or maybe it'll come in Chulin or somewhere else. I imagine we're going to get to it eventually. We'll talk about the Emurim and become experts in that. Tikatani uva mincha afilu kula kayemes lo yizrok. So, because after all, we learned earlier that by the korban mincha, okay, even if the korban mincha remains, so let's say the korban ola is entirely gone, but its minchas nesachim remains, lo yizrok. don't do Zrikas Adam. Mincha Udelo Yizrak, don't do Zrikas Adam, so long as all that remains is the Mincha. Ha Yoseres V'Shtei Klayos Yizrak. But implying that if from the animal the diaphragm and the two kidneys remain, you would do Zrikas Adam. Minolan, how do we know this? Rabbi Yochanan Didei Omar, so Rabbi Yochanan himself says, the second guy was essentially quoting Rabbi Yishmael, who was explaining Rabbi Yoshua, but Rabbi Yochanan himself says, Amar l'reach ni chayach, that the pasuk says, for a pleasant aroma, kol sha'ata ma'ila l'reach ni chayach, anything that you offer as a pleasant aroma, and that includes diaphragms and kidneys, which have a pleasant aroma, apparently, makes sense. Givaldik. So we learned that that even if the meat is gone, but a kazayis of the chaylev remains, or a kazayis of the diaphragm and kidneys remain, you can do zrikas adam. The pasuk needed to talk about chaylev as well as reach nichayach, because of chaylev. If it only said chaylev avamina chaylev in yoseres v'shtei klayos lo, I would say that you could do zrikas adam if chaylev remains. But if there's no meat and no chaylev, and all there is chaylev is yoseres and shtei klayos, so maybe you would not do zrikas adam. Therefore, it says the pleasant aroma. That so long as there is a pleasant aroma, you would do zrikas adam, i.e., yoseres v'shtei klayos. If all we had was reach nichach, I might think even the mincha because of achmana chaylev to say no, it has to be chaylev fats to the exclusion of a korban mincha. So now moving on to the next section of today's daf about what to do with the kometz. We get to a new mishnah. Shelo b'klishar is possible Reb Shimon machshir. Okay. Now, if once the kometz is scooped out from the mixing bowl, if it is not put into the kometz bowl, it is possible. Reb Shimon says it is kosher. Okay. Hikter kumtza pa'amayim kshera. If the kometz was burnt in 2 goes, 50% and another 50% kshera. Okay, says the Gemara, Amr Reb Yehuda Brei de Reb Chia. Says Reb Yehuda Brei de Reb Chia. We referenced his brother Chizkiah a few minutes ago, right? That Reb Yochanan was a student of Chizkiah, who was Reb Yehuda Brei de Reb Chia's brother, right? Reb Chia had 2 sons. We also mentioned the other day with Rav Kahana, with the Tumah and Tara. Reb Chia had 2 sons, Reb Chizkiah and Reb Yehuda. So this is Reb Yehuda Brei de Reb Chizkiah. My time de Reb Shimon. Okay. How come Reb Shimon says, so we're going to see a 3-way machlokes now, okay? Reb Yehuda Brei de Reb Chia, Reb Yanai, and Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak. We're going to say 3-way machlokes about what exactly Reb Shimon's opinion is. So it says Reb Yehuda Brei de Reb Chia, the pasuk says, Kodesh kadoshim kachadas v'ka'ashim. Now this is a teaching of Reb Yehuda Brei de Reb Chia that we've already seen way back from the beginning of Masechta Zvachim, already Daf Yud Aleph Masechta Zvachim. I think it was the first place that we saw it. Not that I did remember that actually, but it's also quoted here. I knew that it was early. Anyways, so it says by a korban mincha, Kodesh kadoshimi, that the korban mincha is Kodesh kadoshimi, kachatas v'ka'asham, like a chatas and an asham. Why are we comparing a korban mincha to both a chatas and to an asham? The answer is, according to Reb Yehuda Brei de Reb Chia, Bala Ovda. The answer is Bala Ovda biyad, Ovda biyamin kachatas. That look, if you want to offer the mincha chatas style, offer it chatas style. If you want to offer the mincha asham style, offer it asham style. What does that mean? Well, chatas, as we know all about from Masechta Zvachim, a korban chatas, the dam, the blood of the korban chatas is applied by hand, directly by hand, by the finger, to the corners, to the horns of the mizbeach. You use your hands. Which hands? Well, of course, we know whenever the pasuk says etzba'o, everyone agrees if it says etzba'o, it's your right hand. So a korban chatas is applied, the blood of the korban chatas is applied to the horns of the mizbeach directly with your right hand. So therefore, says Reb Yehuda Brei de Reb Chia, what the pasuk is saying is if you want to offer a korban mincha chatas style, gesundheit. What does that mean? It means that if you want to take a kometz from the kometz bowl, from the mixing bowl, and then just keep it in your hand, carry it up to the mizbeach, and burn it on the mizbeach. Very hand style. You can do a hand style, just like a chatas can be hand style. Use your right hand. Sure, take that kometz, go right up to the mizbeach, and burn it. If you want to do the korban mincha asham style, what's asham style? It means take a kometz from the mixing bowl and put it into a kometz bowl, just like by a korban asham, there would be kabbalah sadam in the kli sharis, and then from the kli you would throw the blood. You do zrikas adam from the kli. I think that's probably the point, is that the zrikas adam from the asham is from a vessel. And now the thing is, Reb Shimon's opinion, we saw recently, I would have to look up what page exactly, but we saw recently that Reb Shimon's opinion is, maybe it was Daf Tes, I can't remember. Anyways, that Reb Shimon's opinion is that in terms of when do you need to use your right hand, you need to use your right hand if either it says etzba, like it says by a korban chatas, or if it says kohanim, but it also says etzba and kohanim. Now, it only says etzba by korban chatas. Therefore, by a korban asham, you can use your left hand according to Reb Shimon. Okay? So therefore, Reb Yehuda Breder B'chia says that, look, if the Kohen wants to offer the korban mincha chatas style and take the kometz with his right hand and just go right up to the top of the mizbeach and burn it right away, he's just got to use his right hand the whole time. If he wants to do it asham style and take the kometz with his right hand, of course, from the mixing bowl and put it in the kometz bowl, well, from that point, the Kohen can now use his left hand if he chooses. At that point, you don't need to use the right hand anymore, and you can take the kometz bowl up to the mizbeach with his left hand and burn it on the mizbeach. So again, so the pasuk says kodesh kodashim kachatas v'ka'ashim pala ovda biyad ovda biyamin kachatas. If he wants to do the kometz and burning entirely with his hand, he may. But he just has to use his right hand, like by korban chatas. Bekli of the small ka'ashim. If he wants to take the kometz and put it in a kometz bowl, he can do that and even use his left hand once it's been put in the bowl. I assume that it's once it's been put in. You see, everyone agrees that the kmitza, taking the kometz, we learned about this, I believe, on Daf Tes, that everyone agrees that the taking of the kometz needs to be with your right hand. That needs to be done with your right hand. Now, if you're putting it in a bowl, does the putting in the bowl need to be with your right hand? I don't necessarily know about that. But certainly once it's in the bowl, according to Rabbi Yehuda Bar Bechia, he would say that according to Reb Shimon, since it's asham style, you can even use your left hand from that point. Okay. Rabbi Yanai, says Rabbi Yanai, kevan shekomtzo mikli sharis, that once the kometz has been separated from the mixing bowl with your right hand, at that point, then you don't need to use your right hand anymore. At that point, once the kemitza was done with the right hand, taking it up to the mizbech, you don't need to take it up with your right hand. You could take it up with your left hand. You could take it up you could wrap it up in your gartel. You can put it in a earthenware vessel. At that point, you could do Reb Shimon, right? Because what did the Mishnah say? Shelo b'chli sharis paul. So Reb Shimon machshir. Reb Shimon says you don't need a kli sharis once the kometz has been scooped up, and at that point you don't need to use your right. There's no rules at that point. At that point, there's no rules. Put in a kli sharis, bring it up that way, whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Whereas Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, look, everyone agrees, including Reb Shimon, everyone agrees, says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, that you have to take the kometz with your right hand, of course, from the mixing bowl and put it in the kometz bowl. Reb Shimon agrees with that also. Reb Shimon also agrees that the kometz needs to be put in the kometz bowl. Where they differ is that whereas the Tanna Kama would say that bowl then needs to be brought up to the Mizbeach and I guess the kometz would then be deposited on the Mizbeach from the bowl. Reb Shimon says once the kometz has been deposited in the kometz bowl, at that point he could scoop it out of the kometz bowl and just carry it up to the Mizbeach and burn it by hand. But Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says everybody agrees that the kometz would at least need to be deposited in the kometz bowl. So we've seen three opinions now on how to understand Reb Shimon. We have the opinion of Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia, who says that the opinion of Reb Shimon is that the kometz does not need to be put in a kometz bowl. Now, if he's choosing to do that, he can put it in a kometz bowl, but if he's choosing not to put the kometz in the kometz bowl, he does need to bring it up to the Mizbeach and burn it on the Mizbeach, all using his right hand. Rabbi Yana disagrees and says, not only does the kometz not need to be deposited in a kometz bowl, honestly, once it's kometzed, you can do whatever you want with it. Wrap it in your gartel, put in a kli cheres, use your left hand. At that point, it doesn't matter if he so chooses not to put it in a kometz bowl. He can do whatever he wants with it, so long as he burns it. And Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says that actually, you do have to put, even according to Reb Shimon, you do have to put it in the kometz bowl. Once it's been put in the kometz bowl, at that point, Reb Shimon says, okay, you can take it out if you want and bring it up to the Mizbeach and burn it, that's fine. But it does need to go into the kometz bowl. Meisvei, we have a question against Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia. Ektu chalav ve'evarim ve'eitzim, the burning of the fats and the limbs of korbanis and wood, she'elan bein bayad bein bekli, that were brought up to the Mizbeach, whether in one's hand or whether in a vessel, bein biyamin bein bismol, whether using one's right hand, whether using one's left hand, the coin's right hand, the coin's left hand, ksherin, they're ksherin. Now, the important part for us, hakometz, ve'aktores, ve'alevona, in terms of bringing up to the Mizbeach, the kometz of a mincha, ktores, incense, levona, frankincense, shehelon, that were brought up to the Mizbeach, bein bayad, bein bekli, whether in your hand, whether in the kohen's hand, whether in a vessel, bein biyamin, bein bismoil, whether the kohen is using his right hand or even if he's using his left hand. Kisherin, they're ksherin, to you have to do Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia, that's a kasha in Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia, because Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia had said that if the kohen chooses to use just his hand, then he's doing it chata style. I.e., he has to be his right hand. Yet over here, it seems to be saying bein biyamin, bein bismoy. He can even use his left hand. Right? It sounds like he has a lot of options. Bein biyad, bein bekli, bein biyamin, bein bismol. Whereas Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia says if he's using his hand, it has to be his right hand. And here we have a brisa which sounds like it's saying that he can even use his left hand. Amalach Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia. Now, so also before we move on to Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia's answer, I do want to point out, this is going to be important for later, that here we have a brisa that seems to be unlike Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia. That seems to be saying that once the kometz has been taken from the mixing bowl, it can even be brought up to the mizbeach and burnt using one's left hand. Right? That is right. Bein biyamin, bein bismol. We said bein biyad, bein b'kli, bein biyam, bein bismol. The implication of this brisa is that once the kometz has been taken from the mixing bowl, at that point you can even use your left hand going forward, which is a question on Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia. However, friends, who does it support? Reb Yanai. Right? That's what Reb Yanai had said, right? Reb Yanai had said that once the kometz is taken from the mixing bowl, you can even wrap it in your gartel. You can even put in a kli cheres. You can certainly use your left hand. So this is totally supportive of Reb Yanai. However, it poses a difficulty for Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia, who said that if you choose to use your hand, you got to use your right hand. But remember that this is a support for Reb Yanai because it's going to be important for later when he's looking for support. He's going to come back to this brisa. So Amalach Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia. So Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia defends himself litztadin, and he says, look, if you notice, the brisa says bein bayad, bein bekli, bein biyamin, bein bismol. Reb Yehuda Breder Reb Chia says there's a pattern there. That when we say yad and kli, that aligns with yamin and small. What it means that if you're going to use your hand, then you're going to use your right hand. If you're going to use a kli, you can even use your left hand, right? It's not, the order is important. bein b'yad, bein b'kli, bein b'yamin, bein b'small. Yamin applies to yad, small applies to kli. So katani, so b'yad b'yamin, when it says you can use your hand, so then that means it has to be your right hand. B'kli, it can even be your left hand. If you can use a vessel, if you're going to put the kometz in a kometz bowl, so then bein b'yamin, bein b'small, whether your right hand, whether your left hand, you can even use your left hand. Tashmakam in here. Komso, skip the word shalo. Komso mikli shares. If the kometz was taken from the mixing bowl, the kitcho shalo b'kli shares, and then placed in a vessel that was not a kli shares. V'helo, and he brought it up to mizbeach v'tira and burnt the kometz to mizbeach shalo b'kli shares. Again, not using the kli shares anymore. Posel. That's a problem. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Machshin. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon say that it is fine. B'matan kli, even though it was not put in a mixing bowl. Now who's that a question on? Again, we just said that the kometz was taken from the mixing bowl and was not put in a klisharis. It was put in just a regular vessel. And we see it's a machlokes. Tanakama says posel. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say it's kosher. The answer is it's a question on Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, because Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said everyone agrees, even Rabbi Shimon agrees, everyone agrees that the kometz needs to be put from the mixing bowl, needs to be put in a kometz bowl into a klisharis. From there, says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Rav Shimon says you can take it out of the klisharis, out of the kometz bowl. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says everyone agrees that it needs to be put in a klisharis, put into a kometz bowl. Yet over here we have it's a machlokes. Rav Shimon says it doesn't have to be put in the kometz bowl. So it's a kasha of Nachman bar Yitzchak. So ema mimatan kli ve'elach. So Nachman bar Yitzchak will say no. From the time that it has already been put in to the mixing bowl, at that point, Reb Shimon would say at that point it no longer needs to be in. Once it's put into the kometz bowl, Reb Shimon would say at that point it no longer needs to be in a kli sharis. But Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak would say until everyone agrees that up to the mixing bowl, up to the kometz bowl, it does need to be put in a kometz bowl. After that, right, mi matan kli ve'elach, from the time that it's already been put into the kometz bowl, at that point, from then on, it does not need to be in a kli sharetz. Tashma come in here. The Chacham say kometz ta'un kli sharetz. Did I say sharetz? Sharetz. That the Chacham say that a kometz needs to be put in a kli sharetz. Ketzad also komso mi kli sharetz. That the kometz is taken from the mixing bowl, umekacha b'kli sharetz, and it is then put in to a kometz bowl, to a kli sharetz, umalo maktiru b'kli sharetz, and it is brought up to the mizbeach and burnt from the kli sharetz. Reb Shimon says, Reb Shimon came and komso mi kli sharetz. Says Reb Shimon, however, that once the kometz has been scooped up from a mixing bowl, from a kli sharetz, malo umaktiru shelo b'kli sharetz, you can then bring it up and burn it on the mizbeach vidayo, and that's enough. You don't need a kli sharetz. That Reb Shimon says that once the kli sharetz, that once the kometz has been taken from a kli sharetz, it no longer needs to be put in another kli sharetz. It could just be burnt in the mizbeach. Ema is new, so it's a question of Nachman bar Yitzchak once again, who says that everyone agrees it has to be put in a kli sharetz. Ema kevan shekmatzo vikid sho b'kli sharetz. No, rather say that according to that we're talking about once it has been kometzed and already been put in a kli sharetz, malo maktiro v'dayo. Reb Shimon says at that point you could just bring it right up and burn it. Okay, fine. Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak is still kind of sticking to his, or can at least for now still defend his position that everyone agrees that the kometz needs to be first put into a kometz bowl. We are going to see at the end of this next chunk of Gemara that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's position becomes ultimately untenable. Tashma kamanir kometz b'mino v'nosan b'smolo. Okay. So if the kometz was taken with one's right hand, right? So the kometz was scooped out of the mixing bowl with one's right hand, v'nosan b'smolo placed in his left hand, yachzir liyamino. He puts it back to his right hand. Okay, now this is interesting. So this seems exactly like this would be supportive of Yehuda Breder of Chizkiah. Yehuda Breder of Chizkiah says that once the kometz is scooped up with his right hand, If he chooses to continue doing the avoda with just his hands, so he's got to use his right hand. And what do we see here? The kometz was scooped up with his right hand, put in his left hand. We said, no, put it back in your right hand. So it sounds like we dafka need it to be in your right hand. So first of all, it's going to be a problem for Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, because Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, no, don't put it back in your right hand. It's going to be a problem for Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is going to have trouble here. Anyways, but even according to Rabbi Yanai, it's also going to be, sounds like it's this price at least, is going to be tricky for him, because Rabbi Yanai says, no, once you scoop up the kometz with your right hand, at that point you can use your left hand. You can even wrap it in your gartel. You can put it in an earthenware vessel. Do whatever you at that point. The rules kind of ease up. Anyways, Toshma coming here. Kometz b'yamino. If the kohen separated a kometz with his right hand, v'nosam b'smolo, then put in his left hand. Yachzir liyamino. Put it back into your right hand. So again, that seems to be supportive of Yehuda Breder Reb Chia, who says that if you're going to use your hand, you got to use your right hand. Bismolo, if while the kometz was in his left hand, if while the kometz was in his left hand, where it is not supposed to be, he had machsheves chutz limkomo, chutz lizmano, posel vein bo kares. The korban is possible, but there is not going to be a chiyuv kares, since even the machshavas chutz lizmano is while the kometz was in his left hand, not his right hand. However, bimino v'chishev, I added the word bimino v'chishev aleh chutz limkomo posel vein bo kares chutz lizmano pigo v'chayev olav kares. However, if while the kometz is in his right hand, he has machshavas chutz limkomo would be possible, but machshavas chutz lizmano would actually be full on chiyuv kares, full on pigul. Div Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon. This is the opinion of Rabbi Elazar and the opinion of Reb Shimon. So we see that according to Reb Shimon, it really needs to be in his right hand if he's going to be using his hands. Whereas the Chacham say, Kem shenosnu l'smo pasalto matnoso, my time mishum debay kedusha b'chli. If you remember on Daf Chaf Hey, I think it was Daf Chaf Hey, of Masechta Zvachim. Where are we? Let's look at Daf Chaf Hey for a second. Of Masechta Zvachim. Yes. There's a Mishnah on Daf Chaf Hey of Masechta Zvachim that says, Nishbach Adam al Ritzba Vasaf Apostle. If you remember. There's a Mishnah in Masechta Zvachim on Daf Chaf Hey that says that if when slaughtering a korban, the blood squirts out on the floor, it needs to be received in a klisharis. But that's not what happened. The blood squirted onto the floor. Puzzle, you can't scoop it up, you can't collect it. Puzzle. Now, if you remember, if the blood was squirted into a klisharis, and then from the klisharis it's spilled on the floor, you can collect it and put it back in the klisharis. But if because it says in the pasuk, midam hapar, the dam has to come directly from the par into the vessel. Dam, ayotziv in a par, or whatever. It's got to go directly, right, because it's got to, the blood that's collected in the vessel needs to have come from the animal, not scooped up from the floor. Anyways, so if the blood of a korban squirts onto the floor, it's possible you can't scoop it up afterwards. And the Chachamim say that since the kometz needs to be placed in a klishares, well then, right, and we know that nesinas hakometz, putting the kometz into the kometz bowl, is the equivalent of receiving the blood into the Kabbalah Sadam. What would we call it? We would call it the what are those things called? Not the bazichin, the mizrak, I think. Anyways, so therefore, just like when the Kabbalah Sadam needs to be received in the klisharis, but instead it squirts directly on the floor, it's possible. There's nothing you can do about it. So here also the Chacham would say, since the kometz needs to be deposited in a klisharis, and instead it was put in your left hand is no different than the floor. It landed in a place where it didn't belong. You can't now fix it by putting in a klisharis. Just like blood that squirted on the floor can't be fixed, the kometz that was put in your left hand can't be fixed. It needed to be put in a klisharis. That didn't happen. So again, the Chacham say, Once the kometz was put in his left hand, pasalto matnoso, placing it in his left hand makes the kometz pasul. My time will come, because that kometz needed to have been put in a klisharis. And since that didn't happen, rather the kometz was put in his left hand. It's the equivalent of blood that squirts out of the animal's neck directly onto the floor, vasafo, that even if you then gather it up afterwards, shapasul, it is pasul. Okay, Givaldi. Michlal de Rab Elazar Rab Shimon lo bo matan kli, which seems to be saying that Rab Elazar and Rab Shimon do not require that the kometz be put into a vessel. After all, they say even once it went in the left hand, you can put it back in your right hand. That's exactly what they said. If you took the kometz, put it in your left hand, no problem. Put it back in your right hand. Whereas the Chachamim are pretty clear that since the kometz needs to go into a kli, putting it in your left hand is the equivalent of it falling on the floor. It's unfixable. And for the fact that they're saying it's fixable clearly means that they, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, hold that the kometz does not need to go into a vessel. Tiyufta, Rav Nachman tiyufta. That is that deems Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's position untenable. And therefore, clearly, according to Reb Shimon, the kometz does not need to be put into a klisharis. As we've been saying, this is supportive of Reb Yehuda Brei Reb Chia. The fact that we're saying nish gefährlich, if you put it in your left hand, put it back in your right hand because that's where it belongs. That's like Reb Yehuda Brei Reb Chia. Now, the Reb Yaneh leimetavet tiyufta. Shall we say that this brisa is a problem for Reb Yaneh, who says that it can be in your right? It can even be wrapped up in your belt. It can be in an earthenware vessel. Certainly in your own left hand, it would be fine. But the Bryce is saying you got to put it back in your right hand. That seems to be problematic for Rabbi Yaneh, right? But as I said earlier, remember that Bryce from earlier, which we initially brought as a question against Rabbi Yehuda Brei Reb Chia, because it sounded like you can use your left hand. Rabbi Yaneh says, remember that earlier brisa on the Amri Kitana the Hector Velavlet Stadim Katani. I hold like that earlier brisa, and it's not like Rabbi Yehuda Brei Reb Chia, and I disagree with Rabbi Yehuda Brei Reb Chia's interpretation that when it says yad, it's referring to yamin. When it's kli, it could be even your left hand. That was Rabbi Yehuda Brei Reb Chia's interpretation, so that it could to avoid it being a question on it, but I disagree with that, and I hold like that brisa is in line with my approach, and I stick with that brisa. And now we're moving on to the next section of today's daf, burning the kometz in multiple goes. The Mishnah had said, Hiktir kumtza pa'amayim kshera, that if the kometz is burnt twice in 2 goes, it is kosher. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Says Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, pa'amayim v'lo paimi pa'amayim. 2 in 2 goes, not in 4 goes, not in 3 goes, not in 2.1 goes. Rabbi Yochanan Amar pa'amayim v'afilu paimi pa'amayim. Rabbi Yochanan says it can even be more than 2 goes. My benai, what's the nafkamina? What's the difference? What are they arguing about? Amar Abzer yesh kometz pachus b'shnei zeisim v'yesh haktar pchusa mikazayis ika benai. The difference is A, how big is a kometz, and B, what is the minimum burning amount? Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi savar ein kometz pachus mishnei zeisim ve'ein aktar pchusa mikazayis. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who says maximum of 2 goes, he says a kometz must be at least 2 zeisim's worth, and you're not allowed to burn less than a kazayis. So therefore, when you have a kometz, which is going to contain at least 2 zayises, and you burn it in 2 goes, you're going to have at least a zayis in each burning, and therefore it's okay. But if you divide it up into more goes, well then you'll likely have less than a kazayis there, and that's unacceptable. So 2 goes is the max according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan savar, Rabbi Yochanan holds yesh kazayis pachus mishnei zeisim veyesh aktar pchusa mikazayis. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says it is possible to have a kometz that is less than 2 zeisim, and therefore even if you divide it in 2, you may have less than a kazayis in each one and in each burning, and that's acceptable. And being that that's acceptable, you can even divide it up into smaller portions as well, and that is okay. So therefore, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says 2 goes and that's it. Rabbi Yochanan says as many as you like. It sounds like And now moving on to the final segment of today's daf. Itmar was stated, kometz me'emoseh matir shirayim ba'achila. At what point of burning the kometz are the shirayim permitted for the kohanim to eat? Right? As I mentioned in the introduction, of course, when you do zrikas adam, so that allows the korban to be eaten, the meat of the korban to be eaten. Now, zrikas adam, it's clear when it happens. You throw the blood in the mizbeach, done. Burning is a process that takes time. You take this dough that we learned about in depth the other day, the 42.3 eggs worth and the 6 eggs worth, not important for now, but the point is, it is important enough, and that was kind of one of the big takeaways from that extra, from that slide over there, was the relative amounts, right? You have flour mixed with a little bit of oil, it's going to make some kind of a doughy thing. So you take a handful of this dough, and you honestly, it's not that much. Honestly, I'm thinking about my mom, like burning challah on this stove. Like, that's probably around, maybe that's more like a kazais, but we're not talking about much. We're talking about like whatever fits in your palm of your hand. That's what's being burned. So I don't know. How long would it take to start burning? I don't really know. But anyways, the point is, the second you drop that dough, that flour, into the fire on the mizbeach, it isn't yet consumed. So just dropping it into the fire isn't going to now say, okay, everybody go eat the shirayim. At what point do we say, okay, everybody eat the shirayim? Now, so again, Imar was stated, kometz me'emosai matir shirayim b'achila. At what point can we say, okay, the kometz has been burnt, you are now permitted to eat the shirayim b'achila, to eat it? Reb Chanina Omer says, Reb Chanina mishe mashla bo es haor. Reb Yochanan Omer mishe tatzis bo es haor berubo. Reb Chanina says, once the fire starts burning, even some of it, so then I think just kind of once it just starts catching on fire, is my impression. Reb Chanina would say, okay, at that point the kohanim can eat the shirayim. Reb Yochanan is more stringent, and he says that you have to wait until the fire is burning most of it. Amalei Rav Yehuda lit Rabba bar Rav Yitzchak, says Rav Yehuda to Rabba bar Yitzchak, Azbrelach time to Rav Yochanan, I will explain to you why Rav Yochanan says that the fire needs to be burning most of it. Because the pasuk says in the context of Sodom, after the Rabbanu Shloim destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, so it says that Avram Avinu the next morning looked over at where Sodom was, and it says, "V'nei ola kitor haaretz ke kitor kivshon," that the fire of the land, that the stream of smoke. The truth is, Lamaisa, we know about this nowadays, right? You see stuff coming out of places that a munition was recently unloaded on, and there is what looks like a kind of pillar of smoke. And so this is, and that was similar to Sodom. That's what it looked like the next day. Avram Avinu peered over Sodom, and he saw that the kitor aretz ke kitor kivshon, that out of the earth there was a, what's the word? I feel like pillar of smoke isn't quite right, but a smoking of smoke. That there was a kind of tall, swirling, but not too fast, kind of like smoky kind of smoking swirl. A smoky kind of smoking swirl. Anyways, so it says there, kitor kivshon. And it says, of course, by the kometz, haktoras hakometz. So you have that kitor. In kivshon male, kitor, a furnace only starts having, smoky, curly stuff? Ad shetatzis or berubo, only once the fire is burning most of it. That's why Rabbi Yochanan says the fire needs to be burning most of the kometz. Omle Ravin bar Rav Ada de le. So it says Ravin bar Rav Ada to Rove. Amre Talmidecha, your students have said Amr of Am in the name of Amam. Now we have seen this phrase recently. I didn't remember, nor did I try to find where we saw it, but we have seen this Amri Talmidecha Amr of Amam. Did we see it over here? Let's see. Give me 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I don't see it. Let's go back to it. So your student said in the name of Rav Amram, Tani, we learned it by saying, Ainli Ella, Devarim Shadarkan, Likariv Balayla, Kigon Evarim Muftarim Shemailo Maktirim Miboa Shemish. All I know is that things that are normally burnt at night, Kigon, for example, Evarim Ufdarim, fats and limbs of Korbanis, Shemailo Maktirim Miboa Shemish. You could put them on the top of the Mizbeach even after Shkia. You could burn them all night, put them on the Mizbeach even after Shkia. Umisaklin Va'ochlin, V'olchin kol halayla, and kula, and they could be burning all night. All night you could be adding more of fats and limbs to the mizbeach. Dvarim shedarken likariv bayom, things that are normally offered during the day, however, kigona kometz, like a kometz, v'alavona, and frankincense, v'aktores, incense, uminchas kohanim, uminchas kohen mashuach, uminchas nisachim, shemaylen umaktir mibo hashemesh, you can offer them after sunset. What do you mean you can offer them after sunset? We just said that they're offered during the day. What it means is not after sunset, but with sunset. Slightly before sunset, you put them on the fire, and then they could stay on the fire even after sunset. That they could continue to burn all night. They just have to be put on the mizbeach a little bit before sunset. Minayin, how do we know this? Says that this is the Torah of the Ola Riba. It's coming to include even these other korbanos that are normally offered during the day, that you can even offer them right before Shkia and Shkia Sachama, and they can continue burning throughout the night. Now here's the question. Va'im bo hashemesh lo mishkachas la shetatzis or berubo. Now, I can understand according to Rab Chanina, you see, because these korbanos, right, including a kometz, is being put on the Mizbeach, we're saying just shortly before Shkia. So I understand according to Reb Chanina, who says it just needs to catch fire, okay, that's enough time for it to catch fire. According to Reb Yochanan, who says it needs to be mostly consumed, we're questioning whether that's enough time to mostly consume it. So this would be a problem for Reb Yochanan, because he says that the shirayim can only be eaten once the kometz is mostly consumed. And yet, we're saying that you could put on the kometz just before Shkia Sachama. That's not enough time for it to be mostly consumed before Shkia Sachama. Answers the Gemara Lokasha. No problem. We're mishmashing two concepts. Kan leklot, kan la'atir. Those are two different things. When the Kohanim are allowed to eat shirayim is different from when the kometz needs to be put on the Mizbeach before Shkia. Those are two different things. The kometz needs to be put on the Mizbeach before Shkia. And for it to be considered on the Mizbeach so that it can continue burning there throughout the night, milichatchila. I imagine b'diavad, once it's all lo yored, I don't know, I'm not getting into that. But enough that it can be acceptable for it to be on the Mizbeach before Shkia. For that, Rabbi Yochanan agrees it's enough just that it catches fire. That's enough. It can now stay on the Mizbeach all night. The Kohanim can't yet eat shirayim though. They are still going to have to wait. Once the fire consumes most of it, at that point they can eat their shirayim. So we're talking about two different shiurim over here. One is how much does the kometz need to be burnt so that it could stay on the mizbeach all night. The other one is how much does the kometz need to be burnt for the kohen to then be able to eat the shirayim, and those are two different amounts. Argues Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Elazar masnila mibo hashemesh. Rabbi Elazar, instead of changing mibo hashemesh by the kometz to say not after shkia but a little bit before shkia, Rabbi Allah says, no, we can, it is talking about after Shkia, and what it's saying is, umukim la bipokim. What it's saying is that if different parts of these offerings popped off of the Mizbeach, you could put them back on the fire all night, milichatchila, even though it's after Shkia. But, yeah, so Rabbi Elazar keeps it as after Shkia, and he just says it's referring to things that popped off the Mizbeach and putting them back on. V'chein ki also Rav Dimi Rav Yanai, and similarly when Rav Dimi came, says the name of Rav Yanai bipokin, it's talking about the things that pop off of the pyre. Wait, would Rabbi Yanai really have said this? Let's see. That when it comes to ketores that pops off of the mizbeach, afilu krotin sheba, even particles, full particles of ketores that pop off, ein machzir nosni, you don't have to put them back. V'tani Rab Chanina bar Manyomi, Rab Eliezer, b'divei Rab Eliezer ben Yaakov, asher tocha la'esh es ha'ola al-mizbech ikule ola ato machzir ve'i ato machzir ikule ketores, that you put back on the pyre limbs of the Ola, but not particles of Ketoris. Now we had on that list of all these things, the kometz, the Ketoris, the Levona, and we're saying that if part of it pops off, you put it back on the pyre. And Rabbi Yanai was saying that too. But Rabbi Yanai also says that you don't do that for the Ketoris. Sami Ketoris, Mikan Ketoris. Okay, take Ketoris off of the list. Chevra, we're almost done. We have 3 tekus and we're done. When Rabbi Elazar would learn Menachos, he would ask the following question: kometz just sidro. If you first put the kometz in the mizbeach, v'sidr olav v'samarach, and put the fire on top of the kometz, you put the wood on top of the kometz rather than the wood already being there and putting the kometz on the wood. Is this a normal way to burn the kometz or not? It's a tie. Chizkiah asks, what if he did this with the limbs of an animal? With the limbs of an ola, I guess. So if he put the limbs on the mizbech and then the wood on top of it, do we say, well, it says, right? Whatever it is, the since it says that the limbs have to go on the wood, do they have to go to the wood? But it also says ala mizbech. Maybe it can go on the mizbech directly, and the wood on top of it. Teku, it's a tie. What if you put the limbs not on the wood, not on the pyre, but next to the pyre? And I guess it would get burnt that way. According to the Mandamur, who says that al, right, al mokta means literally on the ala eitzim, right, means literally on the wood, and there's no way around that. You can't put it next to the wood. The ala eitzim ksiv, it says on the wood. The question is a little bit the mandamar al b'samach, but if you say al means next to, so then ochinami al b'samach, do we say here as well? You could put the limbs next to the pyre, or dilma, or maybe ala eitzim dumya da ala mizbech. Maybe when it says on the wood, it's similar to ala mizbech. Ma'asim, just like there, it's al mamish. It means literally on the mizbech. Afachanami al mamish. Maybe on the wood literally means on the wood as well. Teku, it's a tai chevre. That was daf chavav of Masechta Menachos. Friends, we had a few sections here on daf chav, 4 sections to be exact, on daf chavav Masechta Menachos. We learned when there is a problem with the shirayim, that relates back to the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, when there's a problem with the meat of a korban. So Rabbi Eliezer says you can nonetheless burn the kometz, just like he says afal pisha ein basar yesh dam. So here as well, even though there's no shirayim, you can go ahead with burning the kometz. Rabbi Yeshua says when some of the shirayim remain, burn the kometz. When none of the shirayim remain, do not burn the kometz. Like he says by a korban in ein basar ein dam. And then we got into what exactly needs to remain from the korban. We said even chaylev, if we're talking about an animal, even yoseris and the shterkleus example, for example. What to do with the kometz? What happens now once you take the kometz out of the mixing bowl? Then what happens? So that, of course, needs to be done with your right hand. That's not negotiable. But the rabbis say put it in a kli sharis. That's their opinion. Reb Shimon says no need for a vessel, although even that's questionable. So Reb Yehuda, Reb Chia says you don't have to put it in a vessel. If you do put it in a vessel, you can use your left hand. But if you choose to use your hands, you got to use your right hand, right? Because the pasuk says kodesh kadoshim kachatas v'kashim. If you want to do it chata style, do it chata style, using your hand, specifically your right hand. If you want to do it ashram style with a kli, you can even use your left hand. Rabbi Yanai says, you can, even if you're using your hands, you can use your left hand after the kmitza. You don't need to use only your right hand. Rabbi Yanai says you can even use your left hand, you can use your gartel, you can use a kli cheres. Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak says that everyone agrees that that the kometz must initially be placed in a kli shares, and afterwards it can be removed, although we ultimately proved Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak's position to be untenable. We then moved on to burning the kometz in multiple goes. Rabbi Shua ben Levi says just 2 goes. At least the kazayis must be burned each time, and therefore a kometz is at least 2 kazaysim, and you can divide it in half and have a kazayis for each burning, and that's fine. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says even more than 2 times, because he says that you can have even he says that less than a kazayas can be burned. He says that a kometz can be less than 2 kazayases. And therefore, anyways, if you're dividing it in half, you're going to have, if the kometz is less than 2 kazayases, you're going to be burning less than a kazayas. And even so, that's okay. And he says you can even divide it up even further than that, and that would be acceptable. We then got into the 4th section of at which point the kometz is considered to be burnt such that the Kohanim can now eat the shirayim. Reb Chanina says once it is slightly burning, that is enough, and the Kohanim can go enjoy the shirayim. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says it is not enough. Rather, once it is mostly burning, at that point the Kohanim can go and enjoy their shirayim. Friends, enjoy your day. Have a great Shabbos. Cheers.